Hey everyone, welcome to this podcast called Ken Reads, where I can read out your letter that you've shared with me in the hopes that I can better help you understand what the F just happened between you and the last partner you were dating, whether it was in a relationship or a situationship. I look at these experiences from the lens of attachment theory. I don't just come up with thought terminating cliches like, they're just not that into you, or if they wanted to, they would. While some of those phrases might have their benefit in other dynamics, I try and look at this from the lens of, is there perhaps an insecure attachment issue that's at play in these particular dynamics? And though I am an Australian counsellor, I am not someone who is going to be responding to these letters as if I was with a client. I'm here to provide validation, yes, but I can't provide any diagnoses on these. So even if, a lot of people might understandably hear this and be like, well, that sounds like a narcissist. At best, I'll probably say, sounds a bit narky. I probably won't go any further than that out of respect to my ethical boundaries in regards to what I can and can't do. If you find this of benefit to you, fantastic. That's what I want. And if you want to submit your letter, you're very welcome to, once there is obviously availability per month. And I'll happily read out and share my own 2 cents as to what I think has gone on in your dating experience to offer you a sense of validation for what you've been through, and also to give other people listening a chance to feel like maybe this relates to what they've also experienced as part of collective healing. So with that all out of the way, let's dive in to the latest letter.
Another live, which is going to be a Ken Reads episode as well, talking about avoidant friends. I have been meaning to do a live on this for such a long time because, as a lot of you know, I talk a lot about the romantic relationships, but I know many people, in fact, I dare say every single human being has probably got at least one friend in their life who has an avoidant attachment. They can be playful, they can be fun, they can be the life of the party. They're the person you turn to when you want a problem solved. They're the individuals who are exceptionally good at logically thinking through things, but just as you feel like you've developed the most amazing friend in the world, God forbid you bring up anything emotional and then it can be just as sudden and just as devastating as what happens in romantic relationships sometimes. So we're going to get straight into this letter, and I'm very excited to go into this. So I'll read this letter out, and then if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave them in the question mark box below. I will get through them, and I will happily talk about the concept of avoidant friends because it can be brutal for a lot of people. And hello to everyone who's regular. All right, let's get into it. So this is Nancy's letter. She writes, Dear Ken, I met my first best friend, Emily, in middle school. Oh, and by the way, trigger warning, this particular letter involves topics involving domestic violence, sexual assault. So if this is something that will potentially trigger you, please feel free to opt out now just to protect your ears and also your heart, as well as to be respectful to those who've obviously gone through experiences like this. I obviously don't want to re-traumatize anyone. All right, let's continue. I met my first best friend, Emily, in middle school, and when she moved away, we kept contact online. We'd call happily for hours, but she had a pattern of ghosting me repeatedly for weeks, months, even years, which always hurt. But whenever she returned, I never complained. The last time she reached out, I was 21, and it had been 3 years. We had the idea I would move in with her, but one of the roommates who came to help me move cross-country sexually assaulted me. I cancelled and told her what happened. She was very sorry, but a week later she messaged me blaming me for ruining everything, ended the friendship and blocked me everywhere. I was devastated and heartbroken. Over time I was able to forgive Emily and let go, but I believe it left me with anxious attachment. All right, I'm going to take a moment here to say I am so sorry to Nancy for experiencing this, because whilst we don't have a lot of evidence and information with regards to what's going on with Emily and why she did what she did, I think that's a pretty awful thing to do, where you've had a friend disclose that they've just gone through a pretty horrific assault experience, and then they have had, a friend who's supposed to be a best friend blame you for everything and just vacate your life like that. I think that's one of the biggest acts of betrayal you can possibly go through when you're at your lowest. And I could understand Nancy developing a pretty nasty anxious attachment off the back of that too, because it would probably give you little trust issues and also make you feel like you can't necessarily feel safe to express vulnerable moments with another person. So I'm sorry that you've gone through that. Anyways, let's continue. Nancy writes, I now met my current ex-best friend, Sylvia, 5 years later. We met online and hit it off immediately. To be clear, our friendship was purely platonic. Early on, I found out that Sylvia and Emily were eerily similar in personality, interests, behaviours, even the need to constantly be in a relationship with a partner to feel secure. The similarities were triggering at first, but I reconciled with her and myself that they're not the same person, chalked up to a mere coincidence and moved on. I'm going to just tell you now, in my experience, that usually these things are not just coincidences, and often I find our brains and our bodies are so good at sussing out similar, familiar personalities and dispositions in people. I often have found moments where I'm eerily reminded of this individual from the past when I've met new people, and I have to tell you, my intuition has usually been pretty bang on accurate, and so I urge people to really reflect on that if they get those vibes, and to just be mindful of what they could be getting themselves into, because usually it could be more of what you've had in the past. Anyways, a few months in, she took a 2-month break to deal with family matters. A few months in, she took a 2-month break to deal with family matters. When she returned, I respected her privacy and didn't pry. Weeks later, she revealed her mother had passed away, that they were estranged, and she felt a mix of guilt and relief when her mother passed. Over time, I learned that Sylvia had grown up with a very dysfunctional household and suffered a lot of childhood neglect and abuse. She described her whole family as narcissistic and manipulative, and her mother possibly having undiagnosed schizophrenia and BPD. Well, that's a big combination. Throughout our friendship, she was in constant contact with her family whenever they needed her, unwilling to sever her ties despite how they treated her. It was rare for her to be vulnerable with me, and I gave her my support unconditionally. However, when she experienced any emotionally distressing situation in the present, I wouldn't find out until weeks later. During a night when I gave her some feedback on a story she was writing, she shut down and became very defensive. Later, she admitted she was hypersensitive to criticism because of her family trauma. We became incredibly close, calling 1 to 2 times a week over the next 2+ years. Whenever we had misunderstandings, we'd effectively communicate and clear them up. We'd marvel at how lucky we were to have found each other and both agreed that we'd fight for this friendship. She considered me found family, and I loved her like a sister. But in April, things changed. I mentioned Emily in conversation. I rarely mentioned her, and only as a bad example of a previous friend, but this was the one time I mentioned a positive memory. Sylvia then asked me if I still had unresolved suppressed issues of my trauma with Emily, which surprised me. It had been over 5 years, and I thought of Emily with total indifference and felt nothing. I can appreciate the good memories, but I didn't miss her. I never wanted her back in my life again. So I said, no, there's nothing to say about it. But she kept questioning me for over an hour and had me re-explain my whole trauma. But no matter what I said and did, it was like she wasn't satisfied with my answers, thoughts, and feelings about it. She needled me as if I was unconvinced I could or should be over it, and I started to doubt myself whether it was actually unresolved. She was a psychology major dropout and offered me to talk about Emily with her help and also help me resolve my trauma if she could. I remember thinking that would be awkward and create a therapist-friend dynamic, which is never a good idea, but she encouraged me I could. And wanting to trust her good intentions and her psychology background, I started to re-examine my trauma in the following months. But that conversation made me so uncomfortable. The next day I had an anxiety attack. Yeah, can I just say, I feel like that's a really weird thing to do. I think it's one thing to be quote-unquote a therapy friend, if you will, someone who's good at listening to others and also having reasonable boundaries where you're like, I'm not going to go too deep with you, but I'm happy to listen to what you're talking about. I mean, hey, that's what friends are for. You should be able to talk to your friends about certain things. But this unnecessary need to pry into the past and to dig this up seems like there's a little bit of a savior complex going on here for for Sylvia. It feels like she just needs to pry and be like, let me sort of resolve this with you. It's like, it's none of your fucking business. And apparently, according to Nancy, it's over. So, yeah, that's really bizarre. And I also think it's not appropriate if anyone has studied psychology. Why would you, Like, surely you would have learned about boundaries and why it would be unethical to start acting like the psychologist with a friend. To me, this just screams that there's something horribly wrong in this particular dynamic. Also, there's intrusion of boundaries, which then makes me think, I wonder if Sylvia, that was something she experienced when she was growing up, in that maybe she's the kind of person where she had her privacy invaded and she had very nosy caregivers who just dove into her stuff. So, yeah, this is already sounding really, really, really unhelpful. I can see someone here saying my videos are really helpful. Thank you very much. All right, so let's continue going on. This is already giving me my own sense of anxiety on your behalf, Nancy. I travelled to see her for the first time in May. It went great, but when I returned, things got worse. During the summer, I was having a difficult time in my personal, family, and work life, but when I needed emotional support, she'd give advice that felt indifferent and impersonal. Yeah, I bet she did. When I'd bring up things she said that bothered me, she'd get exasperated and say, well, we hear what we want to hear, or we remember what we want to remember, and express whenever she wanted validation or reassurance, she'd resolve it within herself so she wouldn't have to ask for it, which gave me the impression I shouldn't either. Man, she is so avoidant. She also accused me of mind reading, and I shouldn't predict her feelings if she didn't express them. But she often kept her feelings to herself, sometimes only telling me she felt a certain way weeks later. Oh yeah, this is like screaming hyper-independence and massive avoidance stuff going on for Sylvia. Like, it just seems like she expects everyone to have this mentality of just rationalizing big emotional stuff away, not letting the tough times take you for a turn. It just sort of feels like she doesn't want to sit with the discomfort of someone else. And the fact that she's, trying to help you out as a psychologist friend to help invite you to unpack your trauma, I just feel like this is such an unethical styled relationship and a real violation of your boundaries, Nancy. So yeah, and look, I could understand if you're young and you didn't know any better, it is what it is, I accept that. But still, this just does not feel like a very, gracious friend. And also, I find it very twisted. She, on one hand, was interested to help you unpack your trauma, which, by the way, trauma healing can obviously involve listening to someone and also validating them to provide them a sense of understanding. That is one aspect of trauma healing, for sure. And yet I find it interesting that when you went to her to discuss emotional stuff you're going through, she found it very difficult to be able to even sit with that, just being like, we make meaning of what we make meaning of. Or, our perception is just how it is. Like, I feel like she's using a lot of psychobabble, as in psychotherapeutic terms, to just invalidate you here. Just to bear in mind, a lot of fearful avoidant attachers often find themselves in the realm of psychotherapy, even if they're dabbling in it just for their own sake, because they've often come from some very turbulent backgrounds growing up. So their proclivity and interest in psychotherapy may be very much one out of interest based on their own childhood experiences, even if they're not necessarily maybe made out for, that particular field. And it's a common thing that we often see a lot of therapists, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists who go into this field, not necessarily because it's just their passion, but maybe it's actually because it's part of their survival. Like, they have to know what's going on with people all the time. They're hyper vigilant. So I think in Sylvia's case, as per this letter, I sort of feel like she's using a lot of this psychotherapy stuff as a way of not only protecting herself, but also being hypervigilant. And I feel like she's weaponizing a lot of this against you, and definitely using psychobabble, which is, like I said, where you use psychotherapeutic terms to basically construct an argument that may not make a lot of logical sense. It sounds pithy in the moment, but it might just come out like toxic positivity, or it might just come out as a complete, wanky sort of pretentious statement. Anyways, let us continue. Over time, I started carrying more of the conversations because she preferred to listen rather than engage and would forget to talk about herself. I increasingly became emotionally unsafe with her. I'd rehearse what to say before calls and lie that I was okay when I wasn't, because whenever the conversation shifted on me, it felt like an autopsy, like nothing I was doing or saying to her was right, as she kept getting upset with me over the simplest things, whilst claiming I was the one always misunderstanding her or overthinking. I was always apologizing, became abnormally insecure, and blamed myself for our misunderstandings. When I contemplated taking a break to resolve my issues, she said I should just trust and talk to her and not isolate myself. And still trusting she meant well and knew better. I began self-reflecting and deep diving into self-help videos on YouTube. Oh, this is such a trauma bond in a friendship. This is terrible. Sorry, Nancy, this is not a friendship. You have basically turned yourself into a pretzel to accommodate Sylvia's mood. This is not okay. And I got to tell you, I have actually felt this in friendships as well too. I've had situations where I've almost steered the conversation away from telling a person how I feel truthfully because I'm worried about setting them off, because they almost just become visibly agitated or feel the need to change the topic or the conversation if I talk about myself. And I remember internalizing it way back when, as if I had done something wrong. And I remember there was a time too when I had an avoidant friend where I was talking to them a lot about trauma, as in just generally speaking, not mine specifically, but just the concept of it. And I remember this person literally just stood up and walked away from me when I hadn't really gotten that deep into discussing the complexities of it. And they came back to me as if nothing had ever happened. And I was like, what the fuck did you just do there? And then simultaneously them also saying that trauma's not that complex. It doesn't affect people that much as you might think it does. And I was thinking, that is not a hill I'd want to die on, to suggest that trauma isn't either complex or also that profound in our development when we're growing up. So yeah, it's just to say that I do find a lot of avoidant attachers as friends can often be really not that great at sitting with you and also sitting with your emotional stuff. So you may find you increasingly feel like you're stepping on eggshells around your friend who's avoidant, and you also struggle to really connect about just basically what you're going through, because anything you say, God forbid, you might set them off. And so you feel like you're the problem instead of realizing this is their defensiveness and they're expecting you to somehow just put up with your own emotions and just compartmentalize like they do, which I think is not okay. But it really speaks to, I think in this case, Sylvia's huge hyper-independence, emotionally speaking. All right. 1 week later, I fell into a deep depression, but remembering her thoughts on seeking validation, I brought myself out of it on my own with a lot of journaling and self-work. Next call, she could hear I was emotionally drained, but I didn't want to talk about it, and rather than talk about anything else instead. At the call's end, she pressed me again. We'd made a mutual boundary to talk about personal issues at the start of calls and not late. But as I wasn't ready to discuss it, It was about personal issues at the start of the calls, not late, but as I wasn't ready to discuss it, I've lost my train of thought. Let's just start from this sentence. Suddenly she said that was a deal breaker if something was clearly on someone's mind and they didn't say it. I tried to explain it wasn't about her, but she wouldn't let it go, so feeling forced, I told her what happened. She said she was proud I resolved it on my own, but still upset that I broke our rule, which just left me more confused. I had to talk about my issues at the start of the calls, not at the end, but I couldn't end a call if there was something else still on my mind. This is when I started having stomach issues I didn't know till later were caused by chronic stress and anxiety. Meanwhile, I noticed she began cancelling calls more often. Yeah, this is terrible. So what's happening here is Sylvia, who's clearly mega avoidant in her attachment, is now creating rules and walls about what she can and can't do in a relationship. And I'm going to use another story that happened to me with an avoidant friend I knew ages ago. I remember what they had done was they literally messaged this closest group of friends to say, if you have something you want to tell me, you have to tell me in advance what it is that you want to bring to my attention beforehand. Otherwise, I don't necessarily want to consent to talk about your issues. So basically what they were saying was, if you have an emotionally distressing situation, you had to basically ask this person for consent at all times if they were available to talk about it. And it was so disrespectful to those of us that were part of this friendship circle, and those of us who were, close friends were like, this is just stupid. Like, this isn't the point of friendship. Yes, we shouldn't emotionally dump on others unnecessarily, but close friends also are there also for a bit of emotional dumping within reason. And so it just became such a weird thing when there was just like friends who were in hospital over chronic health situations which were life-threatening being suddenly told, you can't come to your close friend to talk about your emotional stuff. It's like, well, then what's the point of this friendship? So yeah, it's pretty awful when you have a person who's mega avoidant who is constructing these rules, these walls about what you can and can't talk about, and they act very self-righteous and high and mighty about how you communicate. rewarding you 1 minute for getting it off your chest and then punishing you if you didn't say it in a way that made them feel at ease. It's just maddening, to say the least. I gotta say to Nancy, who's written this, this is a really good example of what it's like having this experience with an avoidant friend, because I think a lot of people would have gone through this at least once. And even today, I heard someone share with me that they had someone they reckon was an avoidant friend in their life who basically just had a history of, banishing close friends, ghosting and dropping out, and constantly telling friends in advance, I'm just going to disappoint you, before inevitably cutting and running and creating constant self-fulfilling prophecies, which is pretty terrible. In any case, let's continue. In our last call, she said we needed to call less because she was busier and, quote unquote, something's got to give. Before ending the call, trying to follow her rules was something on my mind and take up her offer to discuss the incident with Emily, my former friend, I brought it up, but she was silent. Then she couldn't judge or take sides. Then she was silent, then said she couldn't judge or take sides. I couldn't understand why she'd offer to help resolve my trauma after convincing me it was unresolved. And then when I did, she had nothing to say, like she didn't trust my experience. We then had a long discussion where I tried to express that being purely objective with people's emotions can be invalidating when you don't consider their subjective experiences. Completely agree. But she argued that this is just the way she is. She didn't want to be a yes man, that her boyfriend was also very objective, and she simply agreed to disagree. She said I was being abrasive, to which I gave up and relentlessly apologized. Okay, Nancy, I'm going to say it now. You are absolutely fawning at this particular point in time. And to be fair to you, I don't think you would be fawning as hard if you had more knowledge and understanding of what you were going through. But to me, you are taking on way too much responsibility for what's going on here in this dynamic with Sylvia. And I do think that this is so unfair, what she's doing to you, where she's basically, on one hand saying, I want to support and help you, but I don't want to, take sides in this situation. It's like, she doesn't even know your former best friend. It's like, for fuck's sake, she's not even in the picture. Like, you can take a side on this. You can actually validate your friend. To me, this just seems like she doesn't want to get emotionally close. And so I think this is her way of trying. And I think this is also something she would have experienced growing up as well too. I wouldn't be surprised if she's probably experienced a lot of devil's advocacy and a lot of other things. Someone here says I would label it narcissism. No, I'm actually not going to go that far. Narcissistic, but would I call this narcissism just yet? Not quite. I feel like there'd need to be a lot more other stuff going on here before I'd say Sylvia's necessarily a narcissist. But yeah, I definitely think this is something that can creep up on a lot of people. I'd say she's probably very self-absorbed, as in Sylvia, the best friend. I'd say that she's, definitely entitled. But would I go so far as to say she has like a raging personality disorder? Not yet. I need more information. A week later, she sent a message stating that last call upset her and made her uncomfortable, that whenever she tries to help, she over-explains for literally hours. So things don't get misunderstood, and yet they still do. And it's become frustrating. She knows I've been really stressed, that I overthink and have panic attacks over things said in previous calls, and doesn't want to be responsible for those bad feelings anymore. That's shame, because she doesn't want to feel like a bad person. And that she needed a bit of a break to collect her thoughts. I felt horrible. I responded immediately, apologized, and agreed we needed a break, but she didn't respond or react, nor tell me how long of a break she needed, which was a boundary we'd agreed to, so neither felt like they were being ghosted, especially since she knew how triggering that was for me. But weeks went by and no response. Oh yeah, the classic detach right there, phase 3 detach. I was squirming in shame. I couldn't sleep or hold anything down due to my unknown stomach pains. My fear of abandonment was triggered and I thought to beg for forgiveness. But that's when I realized that this isn't right. I was initially going to end the friendship, but feeling it would be unfair to not talk it out first, I spent days carefully writing a response to her, as I was afraid I might not get the chance to later. It was long, but in summary I told her I was sorry and took responsibility for my behaviours, words and actions that made her uncomfortable, and agreed I also needed a break, but felt that leaving the conflict unresolved wasn't healthy for either of us, and the silence was hurting my feelings. There are times we both misunderstand each other, but that's not unresolvable. I told her I never blamed her for my anxiety and stress, but admitted I relied on her too much, that she's my friend, not a therapist. I'm her friend, not a patient, and I need to work things out on my own. I continued that I can be too emotionally sensitive and take things too personally, but that if I upset someone, it upsets me because I'm very sensitive to others' feelings. I go on to say I value this friendship a lot and love her very much, and I want to do the work to make it right and set clearer boundaries so that way we can both be okay, but we can't resolve this unless we communicate together respectfully and honestly. I told her to take her time and respond whenever she was ready. I do want to say that I think that with regards to the way you've handled this, Nancy, I think you've done very well given what you knew and also given your past experiences with your former best friend who did a runner on you and also, pretty badly traumatized you. I do think you have definitely taken on way too much accountability and responsibility for this, based on this letter. Sure, there might have been some things you could have done better. You could have maybe had more boundaries with her in terms of telling Sylvia you didn't want to talk about this stuff. You could have maybe talked about different things. But do I believe that you necessarily needed to account for, the fact that you felt emotional off the back of this and say, it's my fault, I'm so shameful for feeling this way? No. But I do think the experience that you've had with Sylvia has led you to this and made you feel like you're responsible for stuff that you are not actually responsible for, which is terrible. So I'm really sorry that you've gone through this. The following week, she sent me a long message. I had to cut it in half as it was so long, but these are the unedited highlights. Okay. Well, now I feel like I'm about to spill the tea. So are we ready for Sylvia, the avoidant attacher's response to her best friend, Nancy? All right. She said, I wasn't ready to chat, but I'm doing this now for some sense of closure. I was never here to argue or blame. I'm growing more overwhelmed and uncomfortable around the idea of staying friends and feel myself reverting back to a harmful mental space that I'd worked so hard to overcome from my parents' family. I've done my best to set boundaries so that way we could make the friendship last, and it only got worse. There are parts of it I do appreciate, but then there are things that are deflected right back at me, and it feels like I'm being lectured to and turning the tables and putting me on the spot for not communicating when this situation was clearly in a very different context. I just needed time away from you, and even that ended up being heavily challenged. I didn't know when I'd be okay or if I was ever going to be, so I felt that I didn't have the obligation to comply with your boundaries if my boundary was crossed multiple times now. I felt I was on the verge of a mental breakdown just by the thought of messaging calling, so any sincerity of an apology is lost. It would have comforted you to have talked it out immediately afterwards, but not me. Okay, let me start that sentence again. Sorry, my brain's like on Friday mode, even though it's Thursday for me. I felt I was on the verge of a mental breakdown if my boundary was crossed multiple times now. I felt like any sense of sincerity of an apology has been lost. It would have comforted you to have talked it out immediately afterwards, but not me. The damage was chipping away at me over months, which is why I started to set boundaries in the first place. Empathy starts with thinking before you speak and understanding how your words and actions could impact someone else positively or negatively, whether you intended for it or not. I'm going to rip this person apart in a minute. It's only natural you wouldn't see all the empathetic work I put in to try to avoid negatively impacting you in calls, because most of my overthinking and effort happens before I speak, which is why your statement felt condescending, dismissive, and in some ways contradictory. Projection City. This was a self-fulfilling prophecy that you willed into existence with your projections and insecurities onto me, and self-sabotaging behavior that made me feel increasingly conflicted. Oh, shut the fuck up. Don't get me wrong, I think you're a kind-hearted person at the core, but you had no logical reason to believe that I was anything like your past friend, or that I'd leave you with her to the point that you pushed... Wait. That I'd leave you had you not hurt me, but you kept looking for ways to link or compare me with your experience with her to the point that you pushed me away. Bitch, you did that. I feel that I was being tested in the friendship and slowly became an outlet for your personal traumas. I was more than happy to listen from an outsider's point of view, but you found ways to rope me into your past issues resolving around your ex-best friend situation numerous times, but she didn't. I cannot bring myself to say I want to continue a friendship that puts me in these mental states. And if you disagree, I'm sorry. That just shows we are just too different on too many levels. There's no compromise that could bring things back to normal or make things okay for the both of us. So I believe we should just go our own separate ways. I did truly care about the friendship, so I hope that you can respect my space and decision. I sincerely appreciate all the support, laughs, motivation, and good times we shared together. But it's clear to me now that we seek different levels of friendship, and I hope that another loving and caring friend can help bring that peace to you. I'm wishing you nothing but the best for your future. Oh my god! Okay, I'm about to attack this, so if anyone else wants to join me in the immolation of Sylvia, please feel free to share your own thoughts and feelings on this disgusting reply. Alright, so let's get into this. I can definitely see where her shame wound, Sylvia's shame wound, just came out in full force, because it seems to me that anytime you, Nancy, felt particularly bad about the way in which Sylvia was talking to you, where you were feeling anxious or stressed out and you wanted to resolve it, she kept feeling like a bad person, that she couldn't support you the way that she thought was helpful. And it's interesting that she decides to basically tell you that it was your constant comparison to your past best friend that led to this situation. It's like, but Sylvia, you're the one who was so insecure about this, you're so insecure about the fact that you even were being compared to a best friend in the first place. Like, you were so insecure to the point of constantly needing to try and resolve this issue with Nancy inappropriately in the first place. And you were the one who made this a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's understandable that Nancy had spidey senses around this. But for you to be like, oh, well, you pushed me away and put me into this uncomfortable position, and I found myself reliving the shadow of your ex-best friend, I'm paraphrasing. It's like, but you did this to her. If you were bothered by it, you should have said something earlier and been like, hey, I'm feeling like maybe there's a few too many comparisons between us, just as you would if you were dating someone, right? Like, if you're in a romantic relationship and your partner's constantly talking about their ex, you'd probably bring it up and be like, hey, I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable. What's going on here? That is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It doesn't sound like you actually brought up your previous friend Emily all that much. It seems to me like she just decided to attack you for these insecurities she was feeling inside of herself. I can see someone here has said, how is this a letter from an avoidant? Wouldn't they just dismiss it? Oh no. Oh no. Here's the thing you got to understand about avoidance is just because the label dismissive goes before the word avoidant for one category of people does not mean they will ignore your letter. Invariably, they will do one of two extremes. They will ignore or invalidate, and or they will rage at it because they're feeling so overwhelmed by shame that they come back at you. And this, to be honest, seems like the psychobabble of someone who's probably more in the fearful avoidant category than a dismissive avoidant. So to me, this really hit hard, and they decided to just give you, like I said, there is a lot of psychobabble here. She's talking about boundaries being crossed. She set walls, not boundaries. She's talking to you about how you had projected something onto her. Maybe there was a little bit of that, but I think she was the one projecting a lot of her own stuff, especially at the end. And I feel like it's so wrong of her to be telling you and lecturing you, empathy is about putting yourself in another person's shoes. You need to learn to think before you say. It's like, this is someone I would dread. The fact that she's done it like a bachelor's of psychology, I would dread if she was in the field of psychology, because she just does not have the capacity to empathize at all to the degree that she would need to be in this field. Like, this is a really, really defensive and offensive letter to read. So I'm so sorry you went through that. Anyways, Nancy replies, I was shocked. She never severed ties with her family, and I couldn't understand how she could twist my message to such an extent, claiming I'm projecting my former best friend Emily on her, when she was the one that reopened my trauma with Emily in the first place. That's what I said. I responded arguing that so much of what she accused me of is exactly what she was doing to me. Yep. And that her behavior in all of this was so inappropriate that I was disappointed in her as a friend and as a person. And that it breaks my heart that she'd thrown our friendship away like it never mattered. I wrote that as if she was going to burn this bridge, I'd burn it for her. And to be honest, Ken, in my distress, I said something hurtful I knew she'd never forgive. I wanted to make sure she wouldn't come back because I refused to be treated and live with the anxiety of being an option ever again. Yeah, good on you. I sent my message and blocked her. We blocked each other on everything now. There's a lot more that was said and happened between us, but that's the gist. It's been 3 months and it's been the most traumatic and painful experience of my life, I can imagine. I'm doing better now, but that first month felt like I was drowning. The last month I'd wake up every day in tears. It's hard to believe I've gone through the same kind of friendship breakup twice. I now know I was hardcore fawning and that my lack of boundaries and abandonment anxiety contributed to our friendship collapse. I know there are things I could have done and said better now that I know I have an anxious attachment, but I really did my best with what I knew at the time. I completely agree with everything you've said, Nancy. Yes to everything you said. Educating myself on attachment theory has helped me feel validated in my experience, but other days I feel like the crazy one and wonder if she was right, that I was the one who self-sabotaged everything. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you. No, I don't think you did. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was definitely fawning and boundaries that could have been there for sure, but you live and you learn. And I trust that you've obviously learned a lot from this experience, and I'm sorry that you've gone through it. Many people may have recognized that story as being similar to not just a friendship, but even something similar to like a romantic relationship. And it just goes to show that our avoidant breakups that happen can just be, equally devastating in intimate settings as they can be even in friendships. So thank you, Nancy, for sharing this. I will say I am really sorry that you went through this on the basis that I feel like, having gone through a really horrible abandonment episode with a former best friend only for this to happen again, especially when it was about that former friend too, where you were basically saying like, hey, I don't like being ghosted. I don't like, going through the same sort of motions with a previous friend. I think you were just setting boundaries in your own way, being like, I just want to be treated with respect, and I'm feeling that maybe there's a bit of similarity going on here. But it sounds to me like this really triggered Sylvia, and she couldn't handle it, and she basically just blew up at you and destroyed a good friendship. And also, I just feel like that whole need to be the savior of wanting to like fix your trauma. It's like any self-respecting student of psychology, in my opinion, I would like to believe, love to believe, would at least remember some basic ethics, which is you don't turn your friends into your fucking patients or clients. Every now and then helping someone out, emotionally is one thing. But this just feels like total violation of, not only boundaries, but also trust and sanctity in friendship. So yeah, Jesus, I feel really sorry for you that you went through that. I just want to round out this piece by saying, I find that very similar to what Nancy went through, it's very common for avoidant attachers not to make good emotional support in friendships, particularly the severe cases, in the sense that even though they can be remarkably caring from time to time, and they can be a lot of fun, they can be, like I said at the beginning of this live, the life of the party, they can be charming. I do find that when it comes to a lot of avoidantly attached friends, if you want that deeper, more emotional support from them, that's where they flounder, and it can be the basis for potential breakups with them. And that's why I find that, for a lot of people, it can feel like stepping on eggshells. Worse is where it feels like you've actually become best friends with this avoidant attacher, and then they just suddenly ghost you, and you're left wondering what the hell happened there. Some of you may know my colleague Tawny, who's joined on my lives many a time, and even on the podcast, where she herself has talked about a friend of hers who just like suddenly left her out of nowhere, only to later reappear saying, I'm in therapy and I realized I'm an avoidant and wanted to apologize for what I did. And a lot of individuals will often get that. Like down the line, they'll often have that avoidant friend reach out of nowhere and say, I'm sorry for what I did. Or, hey, they'll try and almost boomerang back into friendship all of a sudden. And it's just like what you would see in a romantic relationship. So yeah, these fears of intimacy are really, really pretty intense. I can see here, was it really a good friendship? Sounds toxic in power and control struggle. This girl can do so much better. Hello from Ireland. I see what you're saying, but you got to remember too that like when we get these letters, right? When I get them, I should say, I only get often a lot of the signs of things that weren't necessarily working, and where you could start to look back with retrospect and be like, oh yeah, things aren't necessarily turning out all that well. But in the moment, when you're in the thick of the situation, when you're in the forest, you don't necessarily see the forest from the trees, right? You often are quite emotionally invested to all the good times, and your brain can't really process everything from afar. So what you're saying is not necessarily wrong, but it would be, we'd be remiss if we didn't also consider the fact that in this case, Nancy and Sylvia had a friendship that would have been based on a lot of excellent times together prior to this experience as well too, where things just started to, fall away. I'm sure that their conversations probably had so much mirth and excitement to them prior to, this breakdown where Sylvia felt like she needed to constantly compare herself to Nancy's former best friend. So that's why I'd say, even though, yes, it does sound on paper like a toxic friendship, which it ultimately went into, it is one of those things where we have to also consider the fact too that there would be other things as well going on. So yeah, that's what I'd say there. But look, I'd also say too, one other thing I want to just say as well. I respect the intentions of what you said too. I have found in my experience personally, I don't love being told post-breakup, oh, you'll find a better friend or you'll find a better partner if it was a romantic relationship. Because often at the time when you're going through that grief cycle, they may have actually truly felt like they were the best friend, the best lover that you would have had. And in time, you'll eventually realize, oh yeah, you'll find someone who's more emotionally available and maybe better suited for you. But I just want to say again too, that it's okay to feel in the moment. I feel like Nancy's past that stage, but I think it's okay just to say too that I'm not exactly rushing to say to people, you're going to find someone better than Sylvia. You're going to find someone better than your last ex or your last this or that. Because I find a lot of people are sometimes mentally I'm not ready to hear that information just yet. And I know some well-intentioned friends and family just love to jump in with the toxic positivity to celebrate and be like, you're going to find someone so much better anyways. It's don't need to fucking hear that right now. But in any case, let's dive into Q&A briefly before I call it a night. So if anyone has some questions for me, feel free to throw them in the question mark box and we will get this started. Okay. My ex-husband, I think, he's a fearful avoidant. He's not blocked me from any socials. What does it mean? I'm assuming the last part of that is, will he come back? No. I mean, many avoidant attachers will stalk you from your socials, but it does not literally mean they're going to suddenly come back around and want to interact with you again. I can see someone here said, my question box isn't working. Guys, feel free to just throw questions in the chat. We've got a small audience here tonight, so it's totally fine. Feel free to just leave your questions and I'll happily answer them for you as you throw them in. But circling back to this question, no, there's no guarantee that that an avoidant attacher is necessarily going to return. On the basis that whilst there's a lot of people who always say they're always going to come back, I've seen some avoidant attachers who don't necessarily come back, and I think it's a fallacy to just say, oh, well, they always will, when some of them are just done. They're gone. And it really depends on a whole host of other factors too, like how they're feeling, whether they've got coping mechanisms to deal with it. So short answer is, we can't necessarily rely on, whether we can't necessarily state that just because they've still got you on social media, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to return. And I would equally say just because they've blocked you, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to stay away. I have seen so many cases where the avoidant attacher has blocked you only to return in some manner or form down the line. I've seen so many situations where clients have attempted to block their avoidant partner on just about everything, only for the avoidant partner to slip between the cracks and find a way to still reach out and chat with you. So yeah, it's definitely, it's not an indicator of anything. It really will be down to the mood of the avoidant when they finally calm down and they feel shitty or they feel lonely, sad, whatever adverse emotion they're going through, and they feel like reaching out. All right, let's continue. What are your raw thoughts on, before we do this, trigger warning, guys. This question involves, what's the term that we use on social media these days? Basically, this question involves suicide. So what are my thoughts on dismissive avoidance and suicide? There's another term for this that social media prefers, or at least the algorithm prefers it. What's it called again? It'll come back to me. Anyways, what are my thoughts on this? Generally speaking, I don't have many. I find that a lot of avoidant attachers generally don't handle loss of life very well. And so I would say that if they're like, I would say a lot of avoidant attachers, I think, are highly likely to commit suicide because of how lonely they feel. And I would argue that they also don't do very well with unaliving oneself. Thank you. That's the term social media prefers. I don't think avoidants do very well when people unalive themselves. I do find it interesting that a lot of avoidants seem to have a lot of tragedy happen around them, like a lot of the time. Like I was even saying in the letter reading that I did yesterday, that it was interesting how the avoidant attacher seemed to constantly need to point out, in one instance, the dead animals that were around a pond. And I think this is particularly true for those that are on the severe end, where there's a lot of learned helplessness and depression, where they hyperfixate on, the tragedy of life, how sad everything is and how things aren't necessarily going to work out. So I think when it comes to the idea of, unaliving oneself, right? I think it would, A, depend on the avoidant attacher. B, if they're on the severe end, they're probably not going to handle it very well because they don't know how to grapple with, finality and closure. And finally, they are more at risk of also being, unaliving themselves because of all their dysregulation and loneliness. So that's the thing. Anyways, let's get back to the questions. Do avoidants come back after ghosting you? Oh, they can. Like, I had a client who had an avoidant ghost them about a year and a half ago, only to reach out just recently, and they rationalized their behavior away, saying, I didn't ghost you, I was always going to return. I had another situation where I saw a client had a similar thing where their partner just ghosted them off the back of a holiday, only to return 2 years later and start the whole damn thing again. So yes, they can absolutely return after ghosting you, but keyword is can. Doesn't mean will. It really depends on their mood, their feelings, what's going on in their life. So yeah, it can absolutely happen. My best friend ghosted me 5 months ago, and when we saw each other at an event, he just wanted to hug me as if nothing had happened. I've had that. I said no. I was wondering if he was testing to come back. Possibly. I don't know if that's necessarily just testing, though. I think that would literally be a case of their fondness for you came back in that moment. Like, they were probably feeling less activated and less anxious. But I can imagine if you were like, no, I don't want to hug, that would have triggered their fear of abandonment and they would have backed the fuck away. And I imagine they would have probably felt a bit of shame because it would have made them feel like a bad person. And they probably would either feel angry, sad at themselves or at you. So I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't hear from them off the back of that. Or if they did, maybe they were still testing boundaries. So yeah, maybe, could be a bit of that. Anyways, let's continue. My ex-fearful avoidant watches stories and love bombs every 1 to 2 months, but then no text, silence again for weeks. Does he want me to reach out? No. I can tell you now that is a hard no. I think that, look, if he does, then he needs to be more explicit about it. I know some FAs, fearful avoidance, do play tricks like that because they want to test to see if you'll respond in a particular way. But generally speaking, and I would agree with this, is to say, if he goes silent, it's probably because he's been hit by, feelings of unworthiness and shame and he's trying to back away from you for a bit. So no, in those moments, I don't think he does want to reach out. I think what happens is he gets closer to you again after love bombing you, then all that fear of intimacy hits him again and he backs the hell away. That's my interpretation of it. I could be wrong. Maybe he does want you to reach out, but invariably I'd say this is on his terms now. This is his way of controlling intimacy. And I'd argue that, if he really wanted you to reach out in an ideal way, if he was more secure, he'd just, tell you how much he would appreciate that. But I don't imagine he has the capacity to do that if he's doing this. The fact that you're even asking that question would suggest to me that this behavior has not only really hurt and baffled you, but also you're guessing his intentions because he's not very clear on them. It sounds to me like he's very dysregulated. My fearful avoidant ex has been stalking me, which caused me to stalk him out of anger with the rebound. I blocked him, then started to spiral, so I went to unblock him, and he has blocked over the top of me. Why? Oh, this is such a great question. Okay, so I suspect, and this is what I find happens with a lot of avoidance, is when they feel guilt and shame about their actions, some of them, particularly those that I find are more fearful avoidant and the dismissives, can get really angry with you because they don't like feeling like a bad person. They've been made to feel like that throughout their childhood. So a lot of them who externalize their pain may lash out and attack you in these very subtle ways. And one of those ways is that anytime they see a reminder of you, they may block you on everything. And then when they calm down and feel less like a shitty person, they may start to gradually unblock and try and reconnect with you in some ways as well too. It's very common, unfortunately, and it does happen because they often feel quite provoked. So a lot of this behavior is done out of impulse, not necessarily done out of a place of, I need to protect my peace. You actually mentioned something here that I want to bring up, and this is why I don't recommend blocking for everyone, which is when you block an avoidant when you're not ready for it and you're still emotionally dysregulated, understandably, you start to have tremendous anxiety where you wonder, will they feel bad about me? What if I never hear from them again? Will they think I'm terrible for blocking them? How are they doing? What's going on? What if they still really like me? What if they're doing badly and they're not okay? I do not recommend you do that because that's when your what if monster, the part of you that goes, what if XYZ is happening, starts to go wild and you don't have a lot of clarity. And that's why a lot of these tactics, no contact blocking, I'm hesitant to advise people to do that in the early stages of the breakup because I find that it may not always be appropriate for you. So generally speaking, if you're someone new to this, that's where I'd say that applies. But if you're someone like me who's been through this rodeo before, no contact becomes a little bit easier with each time because you're like, bye, I don't need answers, I already know what's going on. So please understand that I'm not saying no contact and blocking are bad generally. I'm saying it depends on who you are and the dynamic that you're in. Because for me, I'm like, I'm not putting up with this shit show, not my circus, not my monkeys. All right, my avoidance sent me messages after a year of ghosting. He deleted the messages before I read them. The next day, he sent me more messages and deleted them again before I read them. And a week later, the same thing. I'm assuming this is a two-part question. No, it is not. Okay. Unfortunately, that's very common because a lot of them may have, I don't know if any of you watched Mike's video that I stitched. He's a recovering fearful avoidant and he talked about how whenever he would drink, he would often allow his walls to come down, allow himself to remember all the good times with the previous ex he was still in love with, and then he'd reach out to them. And then when he did reach out to them, all his guilt and shame would return and he'd back away thinking it was a terrible mistake. And I think that what you're seeing here is a variation of that, where I imagine they reach out, feel really shitty and probably remember all the things in their head as to why they perceived it didn't work out. They'll make up rationalizations in their head and then back away. But it leaves you with a trail showing they're highly dysregulated. They're being interested in you in 1 minute, and then their fears catch up to them, and they back away trying to hide all the evidence, but it's too late. So yeah, I do think this is a sign of dysregulation and a lot of other stuff going on too. All right. I see someone here wrote, at best, we should all avoid avoidance. I have a different take on that, but, I understand the sentiment and where that comes from. Anyways, my ex kept on liking tons of sexy pictures on social media while he stated it doesn't mean anything and he loves me. Why? Because he probably has an underlying addiction, and I also think too this is his strategy for starting to avoid intimacy. This would have been around phase 2 of withdrawal, which is a phase characterized of flaw finding, going into starting to sext other people outside of the relationship, liking sexy photos online, starting to distance themselves from the relationship, claiming that they're too busy at work and aren't actually involving themselves. But yeah, that's definitely a part of their deactivation strategies. And when he says that, he's lying. I think on one hand, he absolutely does still have strong positive feelings for you. But what he's also trying to do by looking at those sexy photos is to try and also distract himself from a lot of those intense feelings of anxiety and to try and distance himself romantically from you because his walls are starting to go up. So that is what is happening there. The variation of that could be that he might, for instance, be cheating on you on the side. He might be, I'm not saying he did this to you, by the way, but that's just one variation. He could even be doing something less than that. He could be sexting other people outside of your relationship. He could be meeting a best friend who he tells you, don't worry, we're just co-workers, but then that becomes a new relationship that he automatically starts and then breaks up with you, right? So That's usually what happens in these kinds of contexts, unfortunately. I can see I've got more questions. Yay. Someone continues the unaliving conversation. He survived unaliving himself and says he's a moron for doing it. So you wanted to know what my thoughts were on dismissive avoidance and unaliving themselves earlier. So I guess this is part 2. Well, I think that does kind of validate what I was saying, which is that a lot of avoidant attachers, I think, are vulnerable to unaliving themselves because of their own stuff. Hell, anxious attachers can too. You know, if you've been through enough trauma, you're going to have those thoughts and feelings for sure. So I do think that is definitely a case of someone who's obviously going through a lot of distress, and I'm sorry that they obviously went through that, because if you're ever in a situation where you feel suicidal, you have the ideation, you act on it, you know, you must have gotten to a pretty bad place to get to that stage, and I am sorry that if anyone ever got to that place, because it's terrible. All right, some new questions. I met up with an avoidant online after 3 years. We were intimate on several occasions, then he avoided making plans and said still want to be friends and talk and have a laugh after being intimate. Was he avoidant or did I get played? And he got cold feet after he got intimate. I see you've got another part here. 9 months since I told him I need time and see if I can be his friend. I never heard from him again. Yeah, that's sounding pretty avoidant. You know, a lot of people think, oh, avoidance, did I just get played? And I would just tell you that avoidance would be the worst players on the planet, on the basis that they can't usually help themselves emotionally, and they often tend to be terrible if they're not working on themselves in ethical non-monogamous relationships or polyamorous style stuff. If, here's the key thing, they are on the severe end of the avoidance spectrum. The average avoidant attacher and person who's leaning slightly anxious probably could do it with good boundaries. However, I think that it's really important to understand that if you're someone with intimacy issues, you're afraid of intimacy, even if you're severely anxious, I wouldn't recommend those styles of relationships either, and you have big fears of abandonment, I do not recommend those styles of relationships because it's going to only exacerbate even further whatever stuff is going on inside of you. So when it comes to being a player, I often find that a lot of avoidance are, they're constantly talked about as if like, oh, they're players. They couldn't play an instrument, let alone another human being, if they wanted to. Because even if they have their harem of exes, even if it may seem like they're misleading, which they can be, and even if they lie and also give you, a facade of their full spectrum, I would say, no, they're not very crafty. When I think of players, and I've read books on players, and I can tell you I can be a pretty good player when I need to be, you do it without emotion. You're very ruthless. It's very cut and dry, and it is very boundary because you don't want to get entangled. If any of you read some of the books written by players, really interesting stuff. It's really cool to see how they act very methodically, and at times in ways that are highly manipulative and controlling. But avoidant attachers aren't usually that methodical. They're far more impulsively driven and often have a lot of messy outcomes because they desire connection. They desire romance and intimacy. Oh, but that's right. They have a fear of intimacy. So usually when they get close, you know how that goes. I can see someone here has said, I never wish to date an avoidant again. I wouldn't survive at another time. Thank you for all the virtual support. You saved a part of me. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for the kind words. No, I know that, look, a lot of people go through these breakups with avoidant attachers and it wrecks them, and it can be really, really, it is, actually, there's no really about it. It is life-altering for people. And, many of you often probably feel that you are Humpty Dumpty, who's just had a big fall, and Humpty Dumpty would like to sit back on the wall, but Humpty Dumpty had all the, kings, horses and men trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But I gotta tell ya, Humpty Dumpty is not going to look the same way that Humpty Dumpty did. Doesn't mean you won't look better or you won't feel better, but you probably are not going to be the version of yourself that you were prior to sitting on that wall. So yeah, that's why I'd say just be mindful of that. I can see someone here has said, so interesting this social media behavior of avoidance. My ex follows more than 7,000 people on Instagram. Almost all are girls or women. Is this a distraction or validation seeking? Both. Because this is their way of getting, validation and also feeling good about themselves, because often a lot of them have very low self-esteem. And they want control because many, particularly straight men, and gay men do this too. If many gay men would do similar stuff too. They may be looking to try and get some control if they've ever had a controlling caregiver. And on top of that too, they also use this as a way of creating emotional distance between them and their partner. So it basically occupies both of those roles. If an individual may present a clear avoidant attachment and also clear traits of cluster B issues, which of those disorders will rule them on their relationship, especially romantic ones? That's such a good question. I actually asked a psychiatrist about this because I wasn't sure myself, and this is now the limitation of my education, because I mostly focus on the attachment stuff. I wouldn't know if there is a thing where the personality takes precedence over the attachment, because the way I was taught about personality is that it's based on dimensions, right? There's dimensions of conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, right? So if we look at that and have the attachment stuff on the side, perhaps we're looking at a person with high neuroticism, low agreeableness, low conscientiousness. So maybe we could make the argument that it's actually the personality that has precedence over the attachment. The attachment sort of gets exacerbated by those personality things. So that's my thinking there. But also we have to consider the emotional stuff too. How does one deal with those feelings of shame? Do we internalize? Do we externalize? Do we go to therapy and work on it? Or do we just beat our fists until we're black and blue because we don't necessarily know how to work through this? So I can't really definitively say what comes first. It's sort of like a chicken and the egg sort of thing. But I would argue that if you have a lot of those dimensions that are not conducive to healthy relationships, the chances are that it's probably going to have a direct impact on how you show up with those attachment behaviors and traits. So that's my 2 cents on that one. It's a really good question. This is sort of, up there with, questions like neurodivergence and attachment. Like, how do the two intermingle? Is it the trauma, or is it, a case of genetics? And this is where, if I'm completely honest, I'm actually really passionate about finding out more of these answers. It also goes up there with questions like, what even is secure attachment? Is this just a thing we've designed as the pedestal of what we should be aiming for? Or is it actually a thing? Is it true that secure people actually are, quote unquote, 50% of the population? Or was that just a random rounded number statistic that we seem to have gotten because people who are secure don't show up to therapy? It's sort of up there with the whole 0.1% of the population are narcissists, when that's the diagnosed number, not the actual number. So, the science is slow, and those of us that are on the front lines only see one section of that. And you got to remember too, a lot of journals and articles are often written by students. So not to say that students aren't capable of writing good academic work, especially journal articles, but it's just to say the science is still catching up with a lot of stuff in this space, which is not to say I disagree with the science or that I don't think it's valuable. It is, but it has its drawbacks, put it that way. So yeah, I don't know the answer to a lot of this stuff, but hey, maybe in 5 to 10 years, particularly with the advances of AI, maybe we'll have some of those answers, because I'm personally really curious, because I almost wonder if, we'll find out more about attachment to the point where it helps us understand how to date, the kinds of partners we should be paired up with. Also it might tie in with things that we have like Myers-Briggs personalities, which aren't, as we know, an evidence-based thing, but they seem to be quirky little titles that do help us from time to time. Maybe we'll also have some validation for things like highly sensitive people or HSPs, because I personally think that's a very true thing for a lot of people. So, who knows? I think that it's food for thought, and I'm really excited by what the future holds, because the field of psychology and mental health is still a baby. And also from a business perspective too, they often say that money, health, and relationships are considered to be the three most profitable businesses for the future. So yeah, and I think relationships is the field that's probably the youngest of the three, because health and finances have had quite a while to grow and amount to a lot of stuff. So who knows? Maybe we'll find, something in the future that helps give us more answers to this stuff, because I think more and more people are realizing how messed up dating and relationships is, and we want to have healthier relationships. So yeah, that's my little TED talk on that. Anyways, is it possible to book a one-on-one session with your teammates from Austria? So whilst I don't have any teammates directly in Austria, you can absolutely book in a session from Austria. My recommendation would be to book in with my teammate Catherine, who I did a podcast with this morning, because she's based in a time zone that's highly similar to yours. And yes, you absolutely can. We do international sessions for everyone who's keen. So yeah, feel free to just go even do a clarity call with one of my team members. Just, you can send them an email, be like, hey, just want to find out who you are, see if I like you, and go from there. And also I should tell you that leading into next year, I'm trying to step back as being the face of the business to try and let you guys see more of my team, which I've already started doing, because I want you guys to see that, there are other people here that you can obviously work on who will validate and support you through whatever you're going through. So that's just a business update there. Let's see. What else have we got here? My avoidant ex-partner told me the love bombing of the first month only happened in my head. She broke up and told me she has never been so heartbroken. So confusing. Okay, so bit of gaslighting going on there, and a bit of contradiction. Because she's on one hand implying that, what you went through never happened, yet she herself is telling you that she's feeling so emotionally distraught by the experience of being with you. So much so that she's used the word heartbroken, a word that we would normally use to describe the end of something perceivably good between you and another individual. So it sounds to me like she is a walking contradiction, which we know many severe avoidant attachers are. And I think she's also displaying a lot of denial over what's happened, maybe to not want to take any accountability and shame, but also I suspect that she's wanting to try and banish you, meaning this is a really cool term that the book Avoidant Abuse talks about, which is this idea of they're basically trying to act like neither of you ever actually existed and meant a thing. It's a very insidious technique that is, done with their intention of trying to avoid any feelings or associations with you because it hurts too much. So maybe that's a bit of what's going on, but it's very gaslighty what they've just said. Let's see, what else have we got here? I always attract avoidance and I am attracted to them. Give me a normal guy, I get the ick. I'm an AP in relationships, but I do feel maybe I am fearful avoidant because why I find good people boring. I mean, you might find people boring for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Like, there are some people out there who I've dated who are lovely people, and I just never had any interest in them. And it's not because I'm drawn to chaos. It's just because there are some people who I'm like, I'm sorry, but there's just not enough here that I'm really invested in. And then there are people who, you may find boring because subconsciously you're trying to tear this person down and make the right person wrong. So that might be a defensiveness thing, which is absolutely indicative of attachment issues because you're not necessarily getting the same thrill that you would normally get from someone who is more, intensely avoidant. And if you find that you're attracted to avoidance, one thing, what's really been educational for me is listen to the podcast that I've got, Ken Reads, if you haven't already. This is an episode of it. Listen to how a lot of these relationships start. They usually start with a lot of intensity, chemistry, 5-8 hour dates, seeing each other all the time, constant texting. It's really interesting because a lot of those things we might think are green flags and signs of things are going well, but after reading about like dozens of these letters and, going through my own client sessions, I'm now starting to think that all of those signs which we once thought were necessarily green flags are actually signs of emotional dysregulation, as well as also being signs that this is not necessarily going to last because it's going, it's just sprinting away, the relationship without any boundaries or clear signs of, it necessarily having any stability and sustainability. So yeah, I'd say for you personally, as to why you find good people boring, well, A, I don't know what good people you're referring to, because that could mean a lot of things. B, don't know what your insecurities and your attachment might be in general. And C, I'd say maybe for now, I'd say that's good. That's still a good piece of information to know about yourself. I would also find out why you find avoidance so, attractive and so interesting, and maybe even why you find good people give you the ick, because that can often lead to a lot of really good information to help you to reverse a lot of that as well too. But I got to tell you, avoidance, they can be absolutely attractive and engaging for a whole bunch of reasons. So I wouldn't beat anyone up, for having those feelings. Like, it's totally understandable. Hell, avoidant love bombing, yum, love it, very nice. Although I don't like it nearly as much as I used to. Will this live be posted on YouTube? I just missed it. Yeah, it will. It'll be posted after I finish it. Then I'm going to do... and then it'll go on all the other platforms like YouTube as well. My avoidant ex ended things after 8 months, but he is a single dad, and I was the first woman he's dated after his divorce, and I met his kids, and he did a blindside breakup. Ouch. I'm sorry you had that. That's terrible. And I've also heard of plenty of stories of the single mums, the single dads, the single parents who've got an avoidant attachment style. It's pretty rough, because usually you're meeting the kids, you're getting involved with their family, you're trying to obviously show up and be, respectful to them and get to know the family, and then it all goes pear-shaped, and you've got to not only grieve the partner you were with, but also the relationship you were building with the kids. It's pretty awful. How many of these avoidant dynamic stories end up well, actually? Well, I can give you a very accurate answer. 0. I have not... Now, please bear in mind, these stories that I've got, most of them are recent, right? So we've got a bit of recency bias. We don't know what these relationships will be like 5-10 years in the future. And I am only very young in my career with a lot of this stuff. So when I have clients talking to me about these things, we're only looking at what's going on in the present. But statistically speaking, I have not found much hope or any for these working out at all. And usually the only way it would work out is if the avoidant attacher, in most of these cases, is also willing and wanting to work on themselves. But that is going to take years for them to work on this stuff, because those that are on the severe end have tremendous insecurities, lots of shame. And so for them to work on it, they really need to have a come to Jesus or rock bottom moment to want to work on it. Let's see, what else have we got? Okay, let's see. I had a bad experience with an avoidant 2 years ago. Now I'm scared as hell, and it's 2 years that I'm single, and I don't have any idea to get in a relationship soon. Fair enough. Seriously, fair enough. I think one thing I would say, though, is if you're feeling a lot of that if you're feeling really scared, it does suggest to me that there's still a lot of trauma in your body and your feelings of unsafety, probably also a loss of trust in yourself to discern, healthy from unhealthy, and also avoidance from secure, if you will. And I would argue that if you wanted to work on that, I think it would be about returning safety to your body. But hey, I ain't here to preach therapy to you if you don't want to go. That's not my place to tell anyone that. It's merely just to say that what you're experiencing is understandable shock off the back of what you've been through. And I'm sorry that you're still feeling that way 2 years after the fact. How can they be so invested in a rebound when they constantly stalk their ex? Because when they're stalking their ex, they still have feelings for their ex. When they're with that rebound, they may only be giving a part of themselves to the rebound, like they have with you. When they're with the rebound, they may be only, there because there's a lack of emotional intensity and intimacy that they were getting from their ex, who they're still trying to communicate with. So in that context, we may find a lot of avoidant attachers have, like I've said, the harem of exes, where the rebound is a strategic position. They haven't thought of it literally like this, but I'm just saying it. The rebound basically is sitting between them and their ex. Now they can have their cake and eat it too. They can get as emotionally invested in their ex, love bomb them, and even, be flirty with them without taking the next steps of actually being in a relationship. Because now oh ho ho, I've got this new person who I'm with, and it would be terrible of me to be constantly talking to my ex online. They get to create the rules. They get to look like a good person. They can tell you that it's inappropriate for them to be talking to you because, haven't you noticed, they're in a relationship right now. So they can be a bit self-righteous about it. So yeah, it's pretty twisted. All right, 2 more questions and then I'm going to go to bed. From my experience, never been with avoidance for years and they all ended up the same. Yep, that makes sense. All right, we've got one more. I got a text from my fearful avoidant ex a few weeks ago talking about how it was a season of reflection and forgiveness. He discussed wanting to reconnect at some point during the blindside breakup. I responded, never heard back. What was the point in him reaching out? Any point in confronting him? Okay, the first part of that question is very classic. It's that whole thing of like the avoidant feeling guilty and shame and wanting to reach out and to connect with you. And, you know, was also really at a point where they were likely, you know, having a moment of euphoria and missing you. And so they reached out thinking, oh, this will all be okay. You know, I want to reach out. I want to connect and see how they're doing. And the minute that they did, they probably felt a lot of shame, guilt, and also had like fear of intimacy moments come back up, and they pulled away. So what they've done is they've basically broken up with you again. Now, the second question, should you confront them? This is such a great question. Now, a lot of people will probably say no, but I'm here to say, and I'm going to clarify what I mean by confrontation. If you want to blast at them, or at the very least have a reasonably civil, you know, message where you basically state how this behavior has made you feel, go for it. If your intention is to do this not to get your ex back, but to express how their behavior has seriously hurt and or abused you, I actually think that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do to get a sense of psychological closure. Because it's so not okay to reappear in your life like that after a season of forgiveness and reflection, only to then just suddenly do the same damn thing that they did before. Nothing has clearly been reflected upon, it's only been reenacted. So, in that sense, I would say, if your intention is to be like, this is just not okay behavior and I don't like this, I'd say that's perfectly reasonable to do. If you're looking to try and have an accord with them to be like, what the hell is going on? You'll probably not get much back in return. You may find that it's quite disappointing reaching out at this stage, but maybe that disappointment is a feeling you should go through just to realize, oh wow, this is the limitation of this particular person and they're not necessarily working on themselves. So it's sad. All right. Everybody, thank you very much for your questions and for participating in this live. And Nancy, thank you for submitting this fabulous letter about a friendship breakup with an avoidant attacher. And I want to just say again, you know, to all of you who've gone through a friendship breakup with an avoidant, they can be absolutely devastating on so many levels, and it can really rock your world just as much sometimes as a romantic relationship. So I hope that for those of you that had listened to today's episode or will go on to listen to it, that it provided you with some validation and comfort for an experience that you might have been through. All right, everyone. Much love to you all. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you may be, and I will be back on for another letter reading tomorrow.